On January 21st, 2026, U.S. intelligence reported that Iran had begun laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz, a 21-mile choke point carrying nearly a fifth of the world's oil. It was the exact scenario the U.S. Navy had spent 30 years preparing for. The ships built to handle it already existed. The Avenger-class, wooden-hulled, non-magnetic, designed to work inside a minefield. But when the warning arrived, they were gone. The last of them had reached Philadelphia the day before, on their way to be dismantled. In the fall of 1950, the Korean War was 7 months old, and the United States Navy needed to seize Wonsan Harbor, a strategic port with access to the East Coast that would cut North Korean supply lines and open a second front against an enemy still reeling from the Incheon landings. For this, a massive fleet of 250 warships and transports steamed toward the coast, carrying 50,000 Marines who needed to be ashore within days. Before any of them could land, someone had to go in first and clear the water. This job fell to the minesweepers of Task Group 95-6. On the morning of October 12th, USS Pirate and USS Pledge, a pair of World War II-era models, were leading the formation through a shallow and cold channel off Wonsan, clearing mines one by one. Mid-turn, the water directly beneath Pirate's starboard side erupted, barely settling, before enemy shore batteries on the surrounding islands opened fire, pouring shells over the already stricken ship. Within 4 minutes, she'd capsized and gone under. Then, as Pledge moved toward the survivors, the ship also struck a mine before she could reach them. 5 more men were lost. The men aboard the ships for the upcoming invasion had no choice but to wait, while a handful of small minesweepers spent the next 2 weeks trying to clear a path through what later accounts described as up to 3,000 Soviet-supplied mines. Watching the crucial operation stall from his flagship, Senior Officer Rear Admiral Alan Hoke Smith sent a message to the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington that read, quote, "We've lost control of the seas to a nation without a navy, using pre-World War I weapons laid by vessels that were civilized at the time of the birth of Christ." Sailors have been dropping explosives into harbors to deny their enemies since the American Civil War, and the basic principle has barely changed. A mine requires no crew, no guidance system, no operator watching a screen from a safe distance. It simply waits for something to pass close enough to trigger it. A weapon that costs a few $100s can destroy a ship that costs hundreds of millions, or force it to take longer routes to reach its destination. Though contact mines float just below the surface on a mooring cable, the devices that sank Pirate and Pledge were magnetic influence mines, firing straight up under their keel and lifting the ship out of the water before slamming it back down, essentially breaking it in two. Years earlier, during World War II, the British and Americans addressed this problem by building wooden minesweepers that generated no magnetic field. After the war, budgets collapsed and programs wound down as planners assumed the threat had passed, leaving the job to all metal ships. After Wonsan, the Navy moved fast. Within a few years, it commissioned nearly 60 wooden ocean minesweepers, the Agile-class, which could cut moored mines loose and trigger influence mines in a safe distance. For 2 decades, that was enough. Then, in the 1960s and 70s, a new generation of Soviet mines completely changed the problem. The UDM-2 bottom mine required no cable, no surface presence, nothing a sweep could catch. It sat motionless on the sea floor, invisible against the silt, and waited. Sweeping gear passed over it without effect. Magnetic triggers did nothing. The only way to clear it was to find each mine individually and destroy it at close range, something no surface ship in any navy could do. Against this new technology, the entire Agile-class was useless. The Navy needed something that had never existed before. In 1982, the Navy gave Peterson Builders in Sturgeon Bay a contract for the Avenger-class, the largest mine countermeasures vessel the United States had built in nearly 3 decades. For the wooden hull, Peterson's engineers settled on 4 alternating layers of oak for strength, Douglas fir for its dimensional stability, and Nootka cypress for its natural resistance to rot and its particular flexibility under stress. Each of these intricate layers was laid with the same structural logic as plywood, but at the scale of a warship. Over it all went a thin outer lamination of fiberglass that sealed the wood against water and smoothed the hull without adding a magnetic signature. The result was a powerful composite that, under the lateral force of a nearby mine blast, would flex and absorb rather than crack and flood. This unique lamination technique also cut the hull weight in half compared to a conventional single-layer wooden hull, making her 224 feet long and only 1,312 tons, with a crew of 84. Everything else aboard was built around the same principle: no magnetic field. The 4 diesel engines were non-magnetic, as were the fittings, the fasteners, and as much of the internal machinery as could be engineered that way. The propellers were controllable pitch, meaning the crew could adjust their blade angle independently, rather than simply varying engine speed, giving the Avenger-class exactly the kind of precise, low-speed maneuverability that mine clearance demanded. At 14 knots, she was not fast, but her control and maneuverability were admirable. Another addition was the AN/SLQ-48, a remotely operated vehicle that traveled up to 3,510 feet from the ship on a tether, carrying high-frequency sonar and a low-light television camera, and moved systematically along the sea floor, building a detailed image of whatever lay there. When it found a mine, it could cut the mooring cable with an onboard cutter, or place an explosive charge directly against the mine's hull, back away to a safe distance on its tether, and detonate. At last, the American Navy could go looking for a bottom mine, find it, identify it with certainty, and destroy it without putting a single sailor in the water. Between 1987 and 1994, a total of 14 Avenger-class wooden minesweepers were commissioned, distributed worldwide in pairs and quartets to areas where the mine threat was most likely to materialize. By the late 1980s, the class was still filling out, still working up, still proving its systems and exercises, when on April 14, 1988, USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine in the Persian Gulf, nearly broke in half. The ship survived, but a weapon that cost Iran roughly $1,500 had nearly destroyed a modern U.S. warship. 4 days later, the United States responded with Operation Praying Mantis, destroying half of Iran's navy in a single afternoon. 2 years later, on August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and Avenger finally had her first war. Since she was too slow to reach the area under her own power in any useful time, she was loaded onto the Dutch heavy lift vessel Super Servant 3, lifted clear of the water, and sat on deck alongside 3 older minesweepers, and was carried right to the area where Iraq had laid over 1,300 mines across the northern Gulf and off the Kuwaiti coast, a combination of moored contact mines and bottom influence mines, seeded across the approaches that any amphibious force would have to use. On the morning of February 18, 1991, a mere 3 weeks into the air campaign, USS Tripoli, an amphibious assault ship directing the fleet's mine countermeasures helicopters, struck a floating contact mine in the northern Gulf at dawn, taking a 16 by 20-foot hole in her forward hull. Less than 3 hours later, and only 10 miles away, USS Princeton, an Aegis cruiser worth nearly $1 billion, hit 2 bottom mines in rapid succession, damaging her enough to put her out of the fight. Though neither ship sank, the option of an amphibious landing on the Kuwaiti coast came off the table that morning and never went back on. In the aftermath, the Avenger-class sister ships went to work. Moving slowly through the dangerous waters that had already claimed 2 warships, they traced systematic lanes across the sea floor, building a picture of what lay beneath. Whenever a contact appeared, the tethered vehicle was sent down to investigate. It descended through the murky Gulf water and closed on the target, confirming what the sensors had found: a mine sitting motionless on the bottom, exactly where it had been placed. The operator positioned the charge, backed the vehicle away, and detonated it. The victorious crews painted a mark on the bridge wing for every mine destroyed, and by the time the ceasefire came, the marks were everywhere. From there, the Avengers spent weeks clearing the Kuwaiti coast, accounting for more than 1,000 mines in total. Everything the design had promised across 4 years of construction and nearly $100 million of public money had clearly delivered results in the brown, shallow, and mine-peppered waters of the northern Gulf. With the new millennium, the Avenger-class settled into the permanent rhythm that would define the rest of its service life. The 14 ships were distributed across the fleet, according to where the mine threat was most likely to materialize. 4 were forward deployed to Sasebo, Japan, watching over the Pacific approaches. 4 more were stationed at Naval Support Activity Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, just across the water from Iran, where they would remain for over 3 decades. USS Sentry, USS Devastator, USS Gladiator, and USS Dexterous became as fixed a feature of the Bahrain waterfront as the pier they tied up to, rotating crews through on regular cycles, while the hulls themselves stayed in theater year after year, because the threat that put them there never went away. Across the Gulf, Iran had been watching all of it, USS Samuel B. Roberts in 1988, Tripoli and Princeton in 1991, the weeks of clearance work that followed. Unlike Iraq, which had bought its mines and laid them in a hurry, Iran had been building its own stockpile deliberately for decades with a specific choke point in mind. According to Western intelligence, the country had accumulated as many as 6,000 mines, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had completely embraced mine warfare as a central tenet of its military doctrine, a deliberate, asymmetric choice for a nation that simply could not match its adversary ship for ship. The specific water Iran had in mind was the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, the single choke point through which roughly 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply moved. A minefield there could make every insurer, every captain, and every oil company in the entire world decide that the risk of transiting was no longer calculable, sending oil prices into territory that destabilized economies far removed from the Gulf. In March 2012, with Iranian nuclear tensions climbing to their highest point in years and Tehran's rhetoric about the Strait growing sharper, the Navy doubled its Bahrain presence to 8 ships. By then, the wooden ships were holding the line. They'd been holding it for a long time. On January 17, 2013, roughly 3,500 miles from the Strait of Hormuz, the Pacific Fleet's USS Guardian was making a routine overnight passage through the Sulu Sea toward Indonesia when at 2:25 in the morning, the hull hit something that didn't move. The impact drove Guardian's bow up onto Tubataha Reef at speed, and the ship's full 1,300 tons came down hard on coral, her bow riding up on the reef structure, her hull taking the weight of herself at the worst possible angle. Each wave pushed her further into the coral, working the hull back and forth across the reef edge through the rest of the night. The wooden composite that Peterson's engineers had laminated to flex under a mine blast was not designed for this. Seams opened. Penetrations punched through the bottom. Water came in. By dawn, it was clear the ship was not coming off under her own power. What took longer to become clear was why she'd been there in the first place. The nautical chart Guardian had been navigating by placed Tubataha Reef 7.8 nautical miles from where the reef actually was. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency had identified the error in 2011 and had never corrected it, and the updated position had simply never made its way back to the ships. Salvage teams spent 10 weeks on the reef before concluding the hull could not come off intact. Guardian was cut into 4 sections with chainsaws and lifted off the coral piece by piece. The last section came off March 30th, 2013. 6 weeks after she'd already been formally decommissioned. Though a little more than a dozen Avengers remained, the loss of Guardian was something more than a number changing. The class that could find a mine the size of a trash can on a silted harbor floor was getting old, and according to some, obsolete. In September 2014, USS Avenger, the lead ship of the class, which had been loaded onto a Dutch heavy lift vessel and carried to the Persian Gulf to do something no ship had ever done before, was retired after 27 years of service. USS Defender followed in October, and many more followed through the decade. To succeed this groundbreaking design, the United States Navy had an answer, or thought it did: the littoral combat ship. Fast and modular, built around the idea that swappable mission packages could turn one hull into any kind of vessel the fleet needed. Mine countermeasures were just one of those packages, which meant the ship was never built around the mine problem the way the Avenger had been. On paper, the LCS was everything the Avenger was not: modern, flexible, and capable of operating at a safe distance from the weapons it was hunting. The program had been in development since the early 2000s, and the Navy had been promising its arrival for nearly as long. Then the program ran a decade behind schedule. When the mission package finally reached testing, its sensors struggled to reliably identify mines in turbid shallow water, precisely the conditions of the Persian Gulf, where fine sediment suspended in the water column defeated the optics and sonar the unmanned vehicles depended on. Each mission required 6 hours of pre-mission preparation. During one exercise off San Diego, an unmanned surface vehicle lost contact with its mothership and drifted toward the Mexican maritime border. The system did not reach initial operational capability until September 2022 and would not deploy on an actual ship until February 2025. Meanwhile, the people who understood mine clearing were disappearing. Mine warfare had always been an unglamorous specialty, and the Navy had never made it easy to sustain. In 2006, it made it harder, dissolving Mine Warcom, the dedicated mine warfare command that had carried the institutional memory of the mission since Korea. When it dissolved, that knowledge dispersed with it. And by the mid-2020s, the United States was sending mine warfare instructors to Belgium to be trained by NATO allies who would never stop taking the problem seriously. On September 25, 2025, the 4 Avengers that had stood watch over the Persian Gulf, USS Devastator, USS Dexterous, USS Gladiator, and USS Sentry, were decommissioned together on the Manama waterfront. With this, the Navy had decided the transition was complete, and a trio of Independence-class littoral combat ships was already in Bahrain with their mine countermeasures packages installed. The following January 2026, the 4 hulls were loaded onto the Seaway Hawk and carried out of the Gulf, too slow to make the crossing under their own power, too old to be worth the fuel. USS Canberra, which had never cleared a mine in combat, escorted them out. The 4 remaining Avengers were in Sasebo, committed to the Pacific. For the first time in 34 years, there was no wooden hull in the Persian Gulf. The Seaway Hawk docked in Philadelphia on January 20th, 2026, and the 4 hulls were already being marked for scrapping. The very next day, an intelligence report landed in Washington describing Iranian mines in the Strait of Hormuz. Within weeks, the situation had escalated beyond anything a single intelligence report could contain. Iran had begun seeding the strait with mines. Sure enough, insurance rates on Gulf shipping spiked. Tanker captains began requesting military escorts. The threat the Avengers had been built to answer, that had justified their presence in Bahrain through 3 decades of Iranian nuclear crises and saber-rattling, was no longer theoretical. On February 28, 2026, the United States launched Operation Epic Fury, a large-scale military campaign against Iranian naval and military targets. The 3 LCS vessels that had replaced the Avengers in Bahrain, and that had never cleared a mine in combat, were now responsible for keeping open the most mine-threatened waterway on Earth. 2 of the 3 had already left the Gulf entirely, spotted at a container terminal in Malaysia, while Iran was actively laying mines in the strait they'd been sent to protect. Still, the Navy has no plans to recommission any Avenger-class ships. The 4 hulls in Philadelphia were already being broken down. The 4 in Sasebo were staying in the Pacific, committed to a different ocean, watching a different threat. The wooden ships were gone from the Gulf. The knowledge of how to replace them had already left. The replacement was untested, and Iran kept stockpiling.